In a climate-controlled vault beneath the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, there sits a figurine no larger than your palm. The clay is the colour of desert sand at dusk, pitted with age, worn smooth by 7,000 years of existence, but it is not the age that stops you, it is the face. The head elongates backward in a shape no human skull has ever taken. The eyes are rendered as deep slits, set at angles that suggest something reptilian, something cold-blooded. The nose protrudes slightly, nostrils flared, unmistakably lizard-like. The mouth is a thin incision, and yet the body is undeniably humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, hands that could grasp, a torso that could walk upright. This figurine was not discovered yesterday. It was excavated in the 1920s from the archaeological site of Tel al-Ubaid in southern Iraq, alongside dozens of others bearing the same features. They date to the Ubaid period, approximately 5000 to 4000 BC, which means they were created before the Sumerian civilization even emerged. Whoever made these objects did not craft them carelessly. The elongated heads were intentional. The reptilian features were deliberate. These were not abstract art. They appear to be portraits. The scholars who first encountered them proposed various explanations: ritual masks, shamanic transformation imagery, symbolic representations of underworld deities. But none of these explanations address the most unsettling detail. The figurines are depicted engaging in ordinary human activities. One holds a baby to her chest, another appears to be nursing. They are not gods in ceremonial postures. They are beings living domestic lives. They are, in the most literal sense, representations of a people. And the Sumerians, who arrived in this same region more than 1,000 years later, wrote extensively about beings who came before them, beings who were not entirely human, beings who ruled for incomprehensible lengths of time, beings who emerged from the waters, who possessed knowledge no humans should have had, who taught the first cities how to live. The Sumerian texts do not call these beings myths. They call them the first rulers, the first sages, the ones who were here when kingship descended from heaven. What if the Sumerians were not inventing stories? What if they were recording memory? Before you dismiss the question, consider this. Modern genetics has confirmed that multiple humanoid species once walked this earth simultaneously. Homo sapiens coexisted with Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis. We did not simply replace them. We interbred with them. Their DNA lives in us. Some of these species survived until 40,000 years ago, some perhaps longer in isolated regions. The idea of a predecessor humanoid species is not science fiction. It is established fact. The question is not whether other humanoids existed. The question is, how long did they persist, and what did they leave behind? The Sumerian tablets offer an answer that archaeology has not yet fully confronted. They describe a world before the flood, a world where beings with extraordinary lifespans ruled cities, a world where fish-like sages emerged from the Abzu to teach humans law, agriculture, writing and mathematics, a world that ended in catastrophe, after which a different kind of human inherited the ruins and the knowledge. Take a moment, if you would, to leave a comment about where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are. This journey is better taken together. Settle in. Let the questions unfold slowly, because what we are about to explore is not a conspiracy. It is a pattern preserved in clay, stone, and the oldest written language on earth. A pattern that suggests the Sumerians did not invent civilization. They inherited it. And what they inherited came from something or someone who was here first. The keepers of memory. To understand what the Sumerians claim to remember, we must first understand who they were and when they appeared. The land they inhabited was called Sumer, located in the southern region of Mesopotamia, roughly corresponding to modern-day southern Iraq. The geography was unforgiving, flat alluvial plains stretching between 2 rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, prone to flooding, with scorching summers and little natural shelter. And yet, around 3500 BC, something extraordinary happened. Cities emerged, not gradually, not tentatively, but with a completeness that has puzzled historians for more than a century. By the time we have archaeological evidence of Sumerian civilization, they already possessed a sophisticated system of writing, cuneiform script pressed into wet clay tablets. They already had complex legal codes governing property, marriage, and trade. They already understood advanced mathematics, including the sexagesimal system that gave us the 60-minute hour and 360-degree circle. They already built monumental architecture, ziggurats that reached toward the heavens in precise geometric forms. They already organized labor, managed irrigation networks, and practiced urban planning. The conventional narrative suggests that all of this developed organically over centuries from earlier, simpler cultures, that the Ubaid period, spanning roughly 5 to 4000 BC, gradually gave way to the Uruk period, which in turn produced the early dynastic Sumerian cities by 3000 BC. And there is archaeological evidence of this progression: pottery styles, settlement patterns, agricultural practices. But there is also a gap, a discontinuity that no amount of pottery analysis fully explains. The Ubaid people left behind villages, primitive temples, and those strange figurines with reptilian features. They did not leave behind writing. They did not leave behind mathematical tablets. They did not leave behind literary texts. And then, within a historically brief period, the Sumerians appeared with all of these things fully formed. The Sumerians themselves were conscious of this discontinuity. They did not claim to have invented their knowledge. They claimed to have received it. Their oldest city, according to their own records, was Eridu, a settlement so ancient that even the Sumerians spoke of it in reverential tones as the first city, the oldest of cities. Eridu was sacred because it was where kingship first descended from heaven. This was not poetic language to the Sumerians, it was documentary language. Kingship, they believed, had existed elsewhere before arriving in Sumer. Archaeological excavations at Eridu, conducted primarily in the 1940s by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, revealed something remarkable. At the site now known as Abu Sharain, they uncovered the remains of a temple complex, 18 successive temple structures, each built directly on top of the previous one, each maintaining the exact same orientation and sacred layout. The earliest of these temples, Temple Level 1, dates to approximately 5400 BC. That is nearly 2,000 years before the Sumerian civilization as we know it. Who built that first temple? The Sumerians would answer, those who came before us, those who established the sacred site, those whose knowledge we preserve. This idea of inheritance rather than invention is woven throughout Sumerian literature. Their king lists begin not with the first Sumerian ruler, but with rulers who reigned before the flood, kings with names like Alulim, Alalgar, Enmen-Luana, kings who, according to the texts, ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the texts tell us kingship was brought down from heaven again, but this time the reigns are shorter. This time the rulers are recognisably human in their lifespans. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian creation narratives, preserved on tablet CBS 10673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, tells this story explicitly. It describes the creation of humans, the founding of the first 5 cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, and the rulers who governed them before the Great Flood destroyed the world. After the flood, the text states everything had to be rebuilt, kingship had to be re-established, knowledge had to be retaught. But by whom? If the flood wiped out the antediluvian world, who preserved the knowledge to pass it on? The Sumerians had an answer for this too. They spoke of the Apkallu, 7 sages who were not fully human, who possessed wisdom from before the flood, who emerged from the Abzu, the primordial freshwater abyss beneath the earth. These sages, according to tradition, taught the survivors how to rebuild, how to write again, how to measure the heavens again, how to construct temples again. Mainstream scholarship interprets all of this as mythology, as symbolic narratives explaining the origins of civilization through the familiar ancient Near Eastern motif of divine intervention. And perhaps that is all it is. But there is an alternative reading, one that treats these texts not as inventions, but as attempts to preserve memory across vast stretches of time. Memory of a world that existed before, a world inhabited by beings who were biologically distinct, who lived longer, who knew things that had to be learned. Consider the language the Sumerians used. They did not describe their predecessors as purely divine. They described them as having physical bodies, as dwelling in specific places, as performing specific tasks. The Apkallu were depicted in Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs as humanoid figures dressed in fish skins or possessing fish-like features. The antediluvian kings in the Sumerian king list are not said to have lived in heaven. They are said to have ruled in cities, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak. These were real places, places the Sumerians could visit, places with ruins that predated their own arrival. What if the Sumerians were doing what any pre-modern culture would do when encountering the remnants of an older, more advanced civilization? They wove it into their understanding of history. They preserved it in their sacred texts. They treated it as the foundation upon which their own society was built. If that is true, then the Sumerian tablets are not mythology. They are archaeology rendered in narrative form. They are the documentary record of what the Sumerians found when they arrived in southern Mesopotamia, ruins, knowledge, and perhaps the last remnants of the beings who had built it all. This raises a question that will follow us through every chapter ahead. What happens when we take the Sumerians at their word? When the stylus spoke. For more than 2 millennia, the cuneiform tablets lay buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, their secrets locked in a script no living person could read. Empires rose and fell over the ruins, Persian, Greek, Roman, Islamic, but the knowledge pressed into those clay surfaces remained silent. By the 19th century, the great cities of Sumer and Babylon had been reduced to weathered mounds, barely distinguishable from the desert itself. Then, in the 1840s, something extraordinary began. European explorers and archaeologists, driven by both scholarly curiosity and colonial ambition, started excavating the mounds. At Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard uncovered the palace of King Sennacherib and, more importantly, the library of King Ashurbanipal. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, carefully catalogued and stored. At Babylon, others unearthed the remains of temples and administrative buildings, likewise filled with written records. The problem was, no one could read them. The script was unlike anything in the classical traditions. It consisted of wedge-shaped impressions, cuneus in Latin means wedge, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. The symbols were angular, geometric, and maddeningly ambiguous. Some appeared to be pictographic, representing objects. Others seemed phonetic. Still others served grammatical functions. Worse, the script had been used to write multiple languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, each with different grammatical structures. The breakthrough came from a most unlikely source, a trilingual inscription carved into a cliff face in Persia. The Behistun inscription, located on a mountain in what is now western Iran, had been carved on the orders of the Persian king Darius I around 520 BC. It told the story of Darius's rise to power in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. The text was identical in all 3 scripts, offering a potential key to decipherment. A British army officer named Henry Rawlinson, stationed in Persia in the 1830s, became obsessed with the inscription. He spent years copying it, often dangling from ropes hundreds of feet above the ground to reach the higher sections. By 1846, he had successfully deciphered the Old Persian version. By comparing it to the Babylonian text, he began to unlock the cuneiform script itself. It was slow, painstaking work. Each sign could have multiple meanings depending on context. Each word could be written several different ways. But gradually, the script yielded. By the 1850s, scholars could read Akkadian and Babylonian with reasonable confidence. Sumerian, being a language isolate with no known relatives, took longer, but by the late 19th century, even it was becoming accessible. And then the translations began to reveal something no one had expected. In 1872, a British museum assistant named George Smith was working his way through tablets from Ashurbanipal's library, catalogue number K3375, a baked clay tablet from the Neo-Assyrian period around the 7th century BC. As he translated the cuneiform, he realised he was reading a flood narrative. Not just any flood narrative, but one strikingly similar to the biblical story of Noah. A man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea that the gods plan to destroy humanity with a deluge. He is instructed to build a boat, to seal it with pitch, to bring aboard his family and representatives of all living creatures. The flood comes, the world is submerged, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim sends out birds to test whether the waters have receded. Smith, by all accounts, was so overwhelmed by the discovery that he began to undress in excitement, running around the room in a state of near delirium. The implications were staggering. Here was a Mesopotamian flood narrative written in cuneiform, predating the Hebrew Bible by more than a millennium. It was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known literary works in human history. But it was not just the flood story that shocked scholars. It was what the tablets revealed about the worldview of the Sumerians and their successors. These were not primitive myths. These were highly sophisticated narratives with complex theological and philosophical frameworks. They described creation, the origins of kingship, the relationships between gods and humans, the structure of the cosmos, and they did so with a level of detail that suggested they were not invented whole cloth, but were drawing on older traditions that the Sumerians themselves considered ancient. The more tablets that were translated, the clearer this became. The Sumerians repeatedly referenced a time before the flood. They spoke of kings who ruled for impossible lengths of time. They described beings who were not gods in the transcendent sense, but entities who dwelt in specific locations, who performed specific functions, who had physical forms and limitations. The gods could be wounded, they could grow tired, they needed food and water, and most intriguingly, they seemed to exist on a continuum with humanity, not as wholly separate beings, but as something closer, something more like an advanced or altered form of life. One of the most important discoveries was the Sumerian king list, first published in 1906, but with the most complete version designated WB444, the Weld Blundell Prism, housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. This text, a four-sided clay prism inscribed during the reign of King Utu-Higul of Uruk around 2100 BC, lists the rulers of Sumer from the beginning of kingship to the time of its composition. It is not a mythological genealogy. It is presented as a historical chronicle, listing cities, dynasties, and reign lengths in methodical sequence. But the reign lengths of the earliest kings are staggering. The text states, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alulgar ruled for 36,000 years. The list continues through 8 kings in 5 cities, with total reigns amounting to 241,200 years before the flood. Then comes the line, then the flood swept over. After the flood, the text resumes, but now the reign lengths are dramatically shorter, 1,200 years, 960 years, eventually dropping to human-scale lifespans of a few decades. Scholars have debated this text endlessly. Some suggest the numbers are symbolic, perhaps representing months or seasons rather than years. Others propose they reflect the immense prestige accorded to foundational figures. Still others suggest they are simply mythological, akin to the biblical genealogies of Genesis that list lifespans of 900 years or more. But none of these explanations account for the abrupt shift after the flood. If the numbers are symbolic, why does the symbolism change so drastically? If they reflect prestige, why do post-flood kings, many of whom were equally revered, have normal lifespans? And if they are purely mythological, why does the text transition seamlessly into verifiable historical rulers whose reigns can be cross-referenced with archaeological evidence? The text itself gives no indication that it considers the antediluvian period to be fundamentally different in kind from the post-diluvian period. It is all presented as a continuous chronicle. The only dividing line is the flood. Before the flood, beings with extraordinary lifespans ruled. After the flood, beings with ordinary lifespans ruled. What changed? Another critical discovery was the Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BC, though the story itself is clearly older. This text describes the creation of humans in explicit procedural terms. The gods, weary of the labour required to maintain the world, decide to create a race of workers to serve them, but they do not create humans from nothing. Instead, the god Enki-Ea in Akkadian instructs the birth goddess Nintu to take clay and mix it with the blood of a slain god named Wa'ilah. The text specifies, "Let one god be slaughtered, and let the gods be purified by immersion. Let Nintu mix clay with his flesh and blood." The resulting beings are called Lulu-Amelu in Sumerian, a term often translated as primitive worker or mixed being. The implication is that humanity was created by combining divine essence with earthly material, but the text goes further. It suggests that what was created was not entirely new, but rather an improvement or modification of something that already existed. The Enki and Ninmah myth, preserved in multiple Sumerian manuscripts, describes a process of trial and error, of creating various forms until the right one is achieved. When these texts were first translated, the scholarly consensus was that they represented religious mythology, creation stories designed to explain human origins within a polytheistic framework. But as more tablets were uncovered, a pattern emerged. The Mesopotamian texts consistently describe a process rather than a miracle. They describe procedures, techniques, even failures. The language is procedural, almost clinical at times, and they consistently reference something that existed before the flood, before the current form of humanity, before the cities as the Sumerians knew them. This is what shocked the 19th century scholars most of all. Not that the texts described gods and creation, but that they described a world that preceded the world they knew, a world that had been destroyed and had to be rebuilt, a world where different rules applied, a world whose memory had been carefully preserved in written form, passed down through generations, inscribed in clay so that it would not be forgotten. The tablets had spoken. The question was whether anyone was ready to hear what they were saying. The list that shouldn't exist. The World Blundell Prism sits in a glass case in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a small clay object you could hold in both hands. Four-sided, inscribed with columns of cuneiform script, it is catalogue number WB444, and it may be the most problematic historical document ever preserved. Not because it is forged, its authenticity is unquestioned. Not because it is poorly preserved, it is one of the most complete versions of the Sumerian king list in existence. It is problematic because of what it says, and because of how seriously it appears to take itself. The prism was purchased in 1922 by Herbert Well Blundell from an antiquities dealer who claimed it had been excavated somewhere in southern Iraq. It dates to approximately 2100 BC during the Ur III period, though the text it preserves is far older, drawing on traditions that reach back to the beginnings of Sumerian civilization. The list is not unique. Fragments and copies exist in various museums, including the Ashmolean, the British Museum, and the University of Pennsylvania. But WB 444 is the most complete, and its account of the antediluvian period is the most detailed. The text begins with a statement of purpose. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This is not metaphor. The Sumerian term for kingship, Nam-Lugal, refers to a specific institution, the organized rule of cities by centralized authority. The text is claiming that this institution originated elsewhere and was transferred to Earth, specifically to Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition. The list then names the first king in Eridu. Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. The second king, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. The text continues through 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, listing 8 kings in total before the flood. The combined reigns total 241,200 years. Then comes the line that divides history, then the flood swept over. After this marker, the text resumes with the city of Kish, where kingship is said to have been brought down from heaven once again. But now the reign lengths are drastically reduced. The first post-flood king, Gushur, ruled for 1,200 years. The second, Kulasina Bil, ruled for 960 years. By the time the list reaches the third dynasty of Ur, kings whose reigns are independently verified by archaeological evidence, the reigns are human in scale: 18 years, 15 years, 9 years. Mainstream scholarship handles this text with a kind of polite dismissal. The consensus interpretation is that the antediluvian section is purely mythological, serving to root Sumerian kingship in a primordial past of immense prestige. The enormous reign lengths are either symbolic, representing the collective rule of dynasties rather than individuals, or they are hyperbolic, designed to evoke a sense of awe. The flood is understood as a literary device separating the mythical past from the historical present. This interpretation is not unreasonable. Ancient king lists often include legendary figures at the beginning of dynasties, and enormous lifespans appear in other Near Eastern traditions, including the biblical genealogies of Genesis. The scholarly approach is to identify where the list transitions from legend to history, usually around the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 BC, and to treat everything before that as mythological preamble. But this approach overlooks several troubling details. First, the text itself makes no distinction between the antediluvian and post-diluvian periods in terms of narrative style or authority. It is all presented in the same formulaic structure: city name, king name, reign length. There are no markers indicating that the early entries should be read differently than the later ones. The only change is the flood. The list treats the antediluvian kings with the same documentary seriousness it accords to historically verified rulers. Second, the locations are real. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak were actual cities. Archaeological excavations have confirmed their existence and their antiquity. Eridu in particular has been excavated extensively, revealing temple structures dating back to 5400 BC, nearly 3,000 years before the list was compiled. The Sumerians did not invent these cities in mythology. They inherited them as ruins, already ancient when Sumerian civilization emerged. Third, the reign lengths, while enormous, follow a pattern. They are not random. They are multiples of sacred numbers in the Sumerian mathematical system, particularly 3600, which the Sumerians called a Sar, and which represented a complete cosmic cycle. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years is exactly 8 Sars. Alalgar's reign of 36,000 years is 10 Sars. The third king, Enmen-Luana, ruled for 43,200 years, 12 Sars. This is not hyperbole, it is a precise mathematical encoding. What could this mean? One possibility is that the numbers represent something other than solar years. Perhaps they represent months, which would reduce Ululim's reign to 2,400 years, still extraordinary, but not impossible if we are talking about a collective dynasty rather than an individual. But this creates its own problems. If the antediluvian numbers are months, why do the post-flood numbers, also extraordinarily long by human standards, appear to be solar years? And why does the text eventually transition seamlessly into reigns that are unambiguously solar years? Another possibility is that the numbers encode the longevity of a biologically distinct population. If the antediluvian rulers were not Homo sapiens, but members of a longer-lived hominin species, their extended reigns might reflect biological reality rather than symbolism. This would explain the abrupt shift after the flood. The old population was destroyed, and a new population, modern humans, took over, bringing reign lengths down to human scale. This interpretation sounds speculative, but it is not scientifically implausible. Modern genetics has confirmed that Homo sapiens coexisted with multiple other hominin species, some of which had significantly different physiological traits. Neanderthals, for instance, matured more slowly than Homo sapiens, reaching adulthood at a later age. If longevity is tied to developmental rate, it is not inconceivable that some hominin species lived longer than Homo sapiens do. We simply do not know, because the fossil record does not preserve soft tissue markers of aging. What we do know is that the Sumerian king list is not alone in describing pre-flood rulers with extraordinary lifespans. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 12673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, recounts the same tradition. So does the Atrahasis epic. So do the accounts preserved by the Babylonian priest Berossus, who wrote in Greek in the 3rd century BC, drawing on much older sources. Berossus lists 10 antediluvian kings with combined reigns totaling 432,000 years, a different figure than the Sumerian king list, but following the same pattern of enormous pre-flood reigns followed by shorter post-flood reigns. The biblical tradition, while radically compressed, follows the same structure. Genesis 5 lists 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah, each with lifespans ranging from 365 years to 969 years. Then comes the flood in Genesis 6:8. After the flood, Genesis 11 lists the generations from Noah to Abraham, and the lifespans drop steadily: 600 years, 438 years, 239 years, eventually reaching the human norm of 70-80. These are independent textual traditions emerging from different cultures and time periods, yet they all preserve the same narrative structure: long-lived beings before a catastrophic flood, shorter-lived beings after. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the consistency is striking. There is one more detail worth noting. The Sumerian king list specifies that kingship descended from heaven twice, once before the flood, when it was established in Eridu, and once after the flood, when it was re-established in Kish. The Sumerian term used minar implies a transfer or bestowal, not an invention. Kingship existed somewhere else and was brought to earth. This is not theocratic language claiming that kings rule by divine right. It is locational language suggesting that the institution of centralized rule originated elsewhere and was transmitted to Sumer. Where was this elsewhere? The texts do not say explicitly, but they offer clues. The antediluvian kings are associated with Eridu, the city of Enki, god of the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm. The Abzu is consistently described as a place, not a metaphor. It is beneath the earth, it contains water, and it is the dwelling place of beings who possess knowledge humans lack. In the Enki and Ninmah myth, Enki retreats to the Abzu to rest and to create. In the Adapa myth, the sage Adapa is said to have descended from Eridu, the city that stands over the Abzu. Could the Abzu represent a geographical region now submerged? The Persian Gulf during the last ice age was largely dry land. Sea levels were more than 100 metres lower than they are today, exposing vast coastal plains that would have been habitable. Archaeological surveys have identified submerged settlements along the Gulf floor. If there was a coastal civilization in this region during the late Pleistocene, it would have been inundated by rising sea levels around 8 to 6000 BC, precisely the period from which the Ubaid culture emerged in southern Mesopotamia. The Sumerian king list may be recording the memory of that inundation, not as myth, but as history transmitted across millennia. A history of a world that existed before the flood, where beings who lived far longer than modern humans established cities and ruled them for thousands of years. A world that ended in water, a world whose survivors brought their knowledge north to the alluvial plains between the rivers, where they taught the next generation how to build again. If this reading is correct, the Sumerian king list is not a list of impossibilities, it is a list of casualties, the Abzu dwellers. There is a recurring figure in Mesopotamian tradition that resists easy categorization. They are called the Apkallu in Akkadian, a term usually translated as sages or wise ones. The Sumerians called them Abgal, which carries similar connotations of wisdom and knowledge. But these were not human scholars or priests. They were something else, something described with such specificity that it becomes difficult to dismiss them as purely symbolic. The tradition is old. References to the Apkallu appear in texts spanning 2,000 years, from the earliest Sumerian literature to the writings of the Babylonian priest Berossus in the 3rd century BC. According to these sources, there were 7 Apkallu, and they existed before the flood. They emerged from the Abzu, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth, and came to the first cities to teach humanity the arts of civilization. They taught writing, mathematics, agriculture, medicine, law, and the proper worship of the gods. Then, when the flood came, they disappeared. Berossus, writing for a Greek-speaking audience, preserved the tradition in the most explicit terms. He describes the first of the Apkallu, named Oannes, the Greek rendering of the Sumerian Yuanar, as a being with the body of a fish and the head and limbs of a man. Each day, Oannes would emerge from the sea and teach the people. At night, he would return to the water. Berossus writes, this being, whose name was Oannes, had the body of a fish, and beneath the fish's head he had another head, and also feet below, similar to those of a man, and he had a human voice. He goes on to say that Oannes taught them the use of letters, sciences, and arts of all kinds. He showed them how to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explain to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. This description has been endlessly debated. Some scholars interpret it as a symbolic representation of a priest or shaman dressed in fish skins, performing rituals that conveyed sacred knowledge. The fish would represent a connection to the watery chaos of the primordial world, and the emerging from the sea motif would signify the bringing of order out of chaos. This is a reasonable interpretation, and it aligns with the broader mythological themes of Near Eastern literature. But the descriptions of the Apkallu are remarkably consistent across multiple sources, and they include physical details that seem oddly specific for purely symbolic beings. The Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs from the 9th and 8th centuries BC depict the Apkallu as humanoid figures dressed in long, scale-like garments that cover their bodies, with fish heads serving as headdresses or hoods. In some depictions, the fish form is more pronounced. The lower body is entirely piscine, with fins and tail. Yet the beings are shown performing very human tasks, holding buckets and cones, participating in rituals, standing beside kings. They are not abstract deities in the distant heavens. They are figures engaged in the world. The Adapa myth, preserved on fragments from the library of Ashurbanipal and from the 14th century BC archives at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, provides additional detail. Adapa is identified as the first of the 7 Apkallu, the wisest of all beings. He is described as a priest of the god Enki in the city of Eridu. The text says, "Wide was his understanding, his wisdom was equal to that of the gods, and his word could not be rejected." Adapa is not divine, but he is not fully human either. He is described as the seed of mankind, which suggests a connection to humanity, but also as having received wisdom directly from Enki, which sets him apart. The myth recounts how Adapa, while fishing in the Persian Gulf, was capsized by the south wind. In anger, he cursed the wind and broke its wings, causing it to stop blowing for 7 days. The sky god Anu, angered by this disruption, summoned Adapa to heaven to answer for his actions. Enki, knowing that Anu would offer Adapa the food and water of immortality as a test, warned Adapa not to eat or drink anything he was offered, fearing it might be poison. Adapa obeyed, and when Anu offered him the food of life, he refused it. Only after Adapa left did Anu reveal that the food was genuine. Adapa had been offered immortality and had unknowingly rejected it. This myth is often read as a Mesopotamian version of the fall of man, an explanation for why humans are mortal. But it also reveals something crucial about how the Sumerians and Babylonians understood the Apkallu. Adapa is not a god. He is not immortal by nature. He has a physical body, engages in physical labour, and is vulnerable to death. But he possesses knowledge that no ordinary human has, and he has access to realms, both the Abzu and the heavens, that ordinary humans cannot enter. The tradition of the 7 Apkallu is preserved in a text known as the Bitmasiri, or Exorcist's Manual, a compendium of rituals and incantations used by Mesopotamian priests. This text, dating to the 1st millennium BC, but drawing on much older sources, lists the names of the 7 Apkallu: Uwana, Uwan Duga, Enmeduga, Enmegalamma, Enmebeluga, and Enlilda, Uchuabzu. The text specifies that these 7 sages lived before the flood, and that they established the foundations of all civilization. After the flood, the text says, a new kind of sage appeared, human sages, no longer Apkallu, but Manu, fully mortal scholars and priests. The knowledge of the Apkallu was passed down, but the Apkallu themselves did not return. Why not? What happened to them? The texts do not say explicitly, but they imply that the flood marked a boundary. The Apkallu belonged to the pre-flood world, and when that world ended, so did they. Only their knowledge survived, transmitted through the human sages who came after. There is an archaeological echo of this tradition. Excavations at Eridu, the city most closely associated with Enki and the Apkallu, have revealed a unique feature. The site sits on a natural spring, an underground source of fresh water that would have been seen as a literal opening to the Abzu. The earliest temple at Eridu, dating to 5400 BC, was built directly over this spring. 18 successive temples were constructed on the same spot, each maintaining the orientation toward the water source. For the people who built and rebuilt this temple over more than 2 millennia, the connection to the Abzu was not metaphorical, it was physical. The Abzu was below, and it was real. This raises an uncomfortable question. What if the Apkallu were not mythological personifications of wisdom, but actual beings biologically distinct from Homo sapiens, who inhabited the coastal regions of the Persian Gulf during a time when sea levels were much lower? What if the Sumerians, arriving in Mesopotamia after these beings had vanished, encountered their ruins, their artifacts, and the remnants of their knowledge, and recorded it in the only framework they had, as the sages who emerged from the waters? Modern evolutionary biology confirms that multiple hominin species coexisted. Some, like the Denisovans, are known only from fragmentary remains and genetic traces. Others, like Homo floresiensis, were discovered only in 2003 on an island in Indonesia, where they survived in isolation until approximately 50,000 years ago. We do not know the full range of hominin diversity during the late Pleistocene. We do not know what adaptations some populations might have developed in coastal or aquatic environments. We do not know what they might have looked like. But the Sumerians described them, and they described them with features that suggest an adaptation to water, elongated bodies, fish-like heads, amphibious habits. They described them emerging from the sea, teaching, and then returning to the sea. They described them as possessing knowledge that humans had to be taught. And then they described the flood that ended that world. The Apkallu tradition is not unique to Mesopotamia. Similar figures appear in other ancient cultures. The Egyptian god Thoth, often depicted with the head of an ibis, is said to have taught writing, mathematics, and astronomy. The Greek titan Prometheus brought fire and the arts of civilization to humanity. The Hindu tradition speaks of the Saptarishi, 7 sages who appeared at the beginning of each cosmic cycle to re-establish knowledge. The Dogon people of Mali described the Nomo, amphibious beings who descended from the sky and taught humanity agriculture and weaving. These could all be independent mythological inventions, variations on the universal theme of culture heroes who bring knowledge to primitive humans. But they could also be independent records of the same event, the transmission of knowledge from an earlier population to a later one, a population that existed before the flood, a population that did not survive it, a population whose existence the Sumerians recorded not as myth but as memory. The Apkallu did not disappear from Mesopotamian consciousness. For thousands of years after the flood, they were invoked in rituals. Their images were carved into palace walls. Their names were recited in prayers. They were remembered not as gods, not as symbols, but as the ones who came first, the ones who taught, the ones who emerged from the waters and showed humanity how to live. And if they were remembered for so long, across so many cultures, perhaps it is because they were real, made from what came before. The creation of humanity, according to the Mesopotamian texts, was not a miraculous act. It was a procedure, a process, and the language used to describe it is not the language of divine fiat, let there be, but the language of technique, trial, and material manipulation. This is one of the most striking features of Sumerian and Akkadian creation myths. They read less like theology and more like laboratory reports. The clearest example is the Atrahasis epic, preserved on multiple tablets from the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, though the composition is certainly older. The text is explicit about the problem and the solution. The gods, specifically the junior gods called the Igigi, are exhausted from the labour of maintaining the world, digging canals, dredging rivers, tilling fields. They rebel, refusing to work any longer. The senior gods convene a council to address the crisis. The god Enlil proposes exterminating the Igigi, but the god Enki offers an alternative: create a new class of worker to take over the labour. The text then describes, in procedural steps, how this is accomplished. Enki calls upon the birth goddess, variously named Nintu, Ninmah, or Ninhursag, depending on the version. He instructs her to take clay from the Abzu, the primordial waters, and to mix it with the blood and flesh of a god. Specifically, the god Waila, one of the Igigi rebels, is slaughtered. His blood is drained. The text says, "Let one god be slaughtered. Let the gods be purified by immersion. Let Nintu mix clay with his flesh and blood. Let God and man be mixed together in the clay." This is not creatio ex nihilo. This is genetic engineering described in pre-scientific language. The divine essence is being combined with earthly material. The result is a new kind of being, human, but infused with something from the gods. But the text goes further. It specifies that this process involves something that already exists. The Enki and Ninmah myth, preserved in multiple Sumerian manuscripts, describes how Enki and the goddess Ninmar create several prototype beings before arriving at the final form of humanity. The text describes these early attempts as malformed, beings that cannot walk properly, beings that cannot reproduce, beings that lack intelligence. These are not described as divine mistakes. They are described as experimental iterations, each one adjusted based on the failure of the previous attempt. The final, successful creation is called Lulu Amelu in Sumerian, a term that scholars have translated variously as primitive worker, mixed man, or man who is mingled. The term Lulu itself is fascinating. It appears to be related to the word lulim, which refers to a wild, untamed animal, specifically a deer or stag that has not been domesticated. The implication is that the Lulu Amelu is a being created from something wild, something that already existed in nature, but which has now been modified, domesticated, shaped for a purpose. This raises the question, what was the raw material? The text suggests an answer, though it requires careful reading. In the Enki and Ninmah myth, there is a passage where Enki describes sending his assistant Ninurta to find suitable creatures in the Abzu region. The text is fragmentary, but it mentions that which walks upright and that which has hands. These are not clay lumps, these are living beings. Hominids. The implication is that Enki did not create humans from inert matter. He took an existing hominid species, something that walked upright, something that could grasp, something that already resembled humans, and modified it. The Akkadian term for this raw material is Adamu, from which the biblical name Adam is likely derived. But Adamu in Akkadian does not originally mean man in the sense of Homo sapiens. It means earth, or more specifically, that which is of the earth, suggesting a creature native to the physical world, not a divine creation. The term later came to refer to humanity as a whole, but its original connotation was something more primal, more rooted in the soil and the wild. Modern paleoanthropology offers a context that the Sumerians could not have known, but which makes their text suddenly more comprehensible. Multiple hominin species coexisted in the Middle East and surrounding regions during the Pleistocene epoch. Homo erectus, the first hominid to walk fully upright with modern body proportions, survived until at least 100,000 years ago in some regions, possibly later. Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals, coexisted with Homo sapiens in the Levant and Anatolia until approximately 40,000 years ago. Denisovans, a sister species to Neanderthals, survived in Asia until a similar time. Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit species, discovered in Indonesia, survived in isolation until as recently as 50,000 years ago. These species were not so different from Homo sapiens that interbreeding was impossible. We know, from genetic studies published in the 2000s and 2010s, that Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals. Non-African modern humans carry approximately 1–2% Neanderthal DNA. We also interbred with Denisovans. Populations in Melanesia, Australia, and parts of Asia carry Denisovan genetic markers. These were not separate evolutionary branches that never touched. They were interfertile populations. They could produce viable offspring. What if the Lulu Amelu described in the Atrahasis epic was not a mythological creation, but a biological one, the result of Homo sapiens populations encountering and interbreeding with archaic hominins still present in the region? What if the Sumerians, inheriting the memory of this process across thousands of years, described it in the only framework available to them, as the gods taking that which walks the earth and mixing it with divine essence? This interpretation is speculative, but it aligns with the details the texts provide. The creation of the Lulu Amelu is not instantaneous. It requires multiple attempts. It involves trial and error. The first versions fail. The process requires knowledge, technique, and biological material. These are not the hallmarks of magical creation. They are the hallmarks of selective breeding, or, if we take the text more literally, of genetic manipulation. The texts also describe the Lulu Amelu as being created to serve a specific purpose, labour. They are not created to rule or to worship. They are created to dig, to plant, to maintain the infrastructure that the gods or the predecessor population require. This too is consistent with a scenario in which an advanced population, the Sumerians, selectively bred or genetically modified a less advanced hominid population to create a workforce. There is another detail worth noting. The Atrahasis epic specifies that the creation of the Lulu Amelu involved not just mixing clay and blood, but also shaping the being within a womb. The text describes 14 birth goddesses being assembled, 7 carrying males and 7 carrying females, to gestate the first generation of humans. This is not a metaphor, it is a description of biological reproduction. The beings are not formed in a vat or conjured out of thin air. They are carried to term in the bodies of the goddesses. Could goddesses, in this context, refer to females of an earlier hominid species used as surrogates to carry the genetically modified embryos? Again, speculative. But the text provides a biological framework, not a metaphysical one. After the Lulu Amelu are created, the texts describe them proliferating, growing in number, and eventually becoming a problem. The Atrahasis epic continues. Humanity becomes too numerous, too noisy. The gods can no longer sleep. Enlil, the chief god, grows increasingly frustrated and proposes various methods to reduce the human population, plagues, droughts, famines. Each time Enki intervenes, teaching humans how to survive. Finally, Enlil decrees a flood to wipe out humanity entirely. Enki, in defiance, warns one man, Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise one, to build a boat and preserve his family and the animals. This is the same flood motif that appears in the Sumerian king list, the Eridu Genesis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and eventually the Hebrew Bible. And in every version, the flood is not a natural disaster. It is a deliberate act aimed at reducing or eliminating a population that has become problematic. What if the flood was not a mythological reset button, but a record of a real catastrophe, perhaps rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, that destroyed coastal populations and forced survivors to migrate inland? What if the Lulu Amelu, the mixed beings, were among the survivors, and their descendants are us? What if the Sumerians, looking back, recognized that they were not the original inhabitants of the land, but the product of an earlier population's manipulation, a population that had vanished, leaving only traces, ruins, and the knowledge to rebuild? The texts do not claim that modern humans were created out of nothing. They claim that modern humans were made from something that already existed. They claim that this process involved technique, knowledge, and biological material. They claim that those who performed this process, the gods, the Apkallu, the antediluvian rulers, are gone now, destroyed by the flood. And they claim that we are what remains. The blood of Kingu. Among the Babylonian creation myths, the Enuma Elish stands apart. It is not a Sumerian text, but a Babylonian one, composed in Akkadian around 1200 BC, though it draws heavily on older Sumerian traditions. The title, When on High, comes from the opening words of the poem, and it narrates the creation of the cosmos through the conflict and triumph of the god Marduk. But buried within the epic's 7 tablets is a strange detail about the creation of humanity, one that has puzzled scholars and resisted easy allegorical interpretation. The story goes like this. In the beginning, there was only the mingling of Apsu, the freshwater abyss, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean. From their union, the first gods were born, but the younger gods were loud and chaotic, disturbing Apsu's rest. Apsu decided to destroy them. Before he could act, the god Enki learned of the plot and killed Apsu. Tiamat, enraged, raised an army of monsters and chose Kingu, one of the gods, to lead her forces. She gave Kingu the Tablet of Destinies, granting him supreme authority. Marduk, the young storm god, volunteered to face Tiamat. In exchange for his service, he demanded that he be made king of all the gods. They agreed. Marduk defeated Tiamat, splitting her body in two to create the heavens and the earth. He then turned his attention to Kingu. Tablet 6 of the Enuma Elish describes what happened next. The gods convened a council to decide what to do with the captured Kingu. The god Ea proposed a solution. Use Kingu to create something new. The text reads, "They bound him, holding him before Ea. They imposed on him his guilt and severed his blood vessels. Out of his blood they fashioned mankind. Ea imposed the service of the gods and set the gods free." Humanity, according to this account, was made from the blood of a defeated god. Not from clay, not from divine breath, but from the literal biological substance of Kingu, a being who had led an army, who had held the Tablet of Destinies, who had aspired to rule. The mainstream interpretation of this passage is that it represents a theological statement about human nature. We are created from rebellion, from chaos, from the blood of a conquered enemy, and thus we are bound to serve the gods as punishment for Kingu's transgression. Our mortality, our toil, our subservience are all inherited from Kingu's guilt. This is a coherent reading, and it fits within the broader theological framework of Mesopotamian religion, where humans are created to serve the gods, to maintain temples, and to provide offerings. But there is another reading, one that takes the biological language more seriously. Kingu was not a transcendent deity. He was described as one of the gods, yes, but the Mesopotamian gods were not immaterial spirits. They had bodies. They ate, drank, slept, bled, and could be killed. The Enuma Elish specifies that Kingu's blood vessels were severed, a visceral anatomical detail that suggests a physical body, and from that blood humans were made. If we strip away the mythological framing, what is being described here? A population, Kingu's faction, those aligned with Tiamat, was defeated. The survivors, or their biological material, were used to create a new population, one that would serve the victors. This is not theology. This is conquest, subjugation, and possibly forced assimilation or interbreeding. We know from modern genetic studies that such processes occurred in human prehistory. When Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa and into Eurasia, they encountered Neanderthals. For a time, the two populations coexisted. They interbred, and then, relatively quickly, Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record, while Homo sapiens populations carried Neanderthal DNA forward. The Neanderthals were not exterminated in a sudden genocide. They were absorbed. Their genetic material persists in us, but they, as a distinct population, no longer exist. Could the Enuma Elish be describing a similar process? Could Kingu represent a population, perhaps an archaic hominin species, or an earlier wave of Homo sapiens that was defeated in conflict and whose survivors were integrated into the victorious population? Could fashioning mankind from his blood be a mythological encoding of interbreeding, assimilation, and genetic blending? This interpretation becomes more plausible when we consider the context of Mesopotamian history. The region was a crossroads of populations for millennia. Waves of migration, conquest, and cultural exchange swept through the Tigris-Euphrates valley. The Sumerians themselves were likely not the original inhabitants. They arrived in southern Mesopotamia sometime around 4000 BC, encountering the Ubaid culture already present. By 2900 BC, Semitic-speaking Akkadians were migrating into the region. By 1900 BC, the Amorites had taken control. Each wave brought new genes, new languages, new traditions. The Mesopotamians were acutely aware of their own composite identity. Their myths reflect this. The Enuma Elish, written during the Babylonian period, presents Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, as the supreme deity who defeats the old order, represented by Tiamat, and establishes a new one. But the old order is not erased. It is incorporated. Tiamat's body becomes the structure of the cosmos. Kingu's blood becomes humanity. The past is not destroyed, it is transformed and repurposed. If the Enuma Elish is understood as a mythological encoding of population succession, one group replacing another, but carrying forward genetic and cultural material from the predecessor, then Kingu's blood is not a metaphor for guilt or servitude. It is a reference to biological inheritance. We are made from what came before. The defeated population did not vanish. It lives on in us. This reading gains additional support from the broader pattern of Mesopotamian creation myths. In the Atrahasis epic, humanity is created from the blood of the god Waila, a rebel. In the Enki and Ninmah myth, humanity is fashioned from clay mixed with divine essence. In every version, the creation involves taking something that already exists, blood, clay, a pre-existing creature, and modifying it. There is no creatio ex nihilo in Mesopotamian thought. Everything is transformation, and transformation implies continuity. If humans are made from Kingu's blood, then we carry something of Kingu in us. We are not entirely new. We are, in a sense, Kingu's descendants. The defeated do not disappear. They persist in their conquerors. Modern genetics provides a framework that the Babylonians could not have known, but which makes their myth eerily prescient. Homo sapiens DNA contains fragments from multiple archaic hominin species. We carry Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA, and likely genetic material from other, as yet unidentified populations. We are a composite species. Our genome is a mosaic of victories and assimilations, of encounters and integrations. We are made from the blood of those who came before us. The Enuma Elish may be describing, in mythological language, a truth that modern science has only recently confirmed. We are not a pure lineage. We are the result of mixture, of conquest, of the blending of populations. Some of those populations no longer exist as distinct groups, but their genetic material persists. We are their continuation. We are, quite literally, made from their blood. Kingu is gone, but we remain. And if that is the case, then the question becomes, who were the other populations whose blood we carry? What did they look like? How did they live? And why do the Mesopotamian texts insist again and again that these populations ruled before the flood, that they possessed knowledge modern humans had to be taught, that they were destroyed in a catastrophe? The Enuma Elish does not answer these questions, but it preserves them, encoded in the image of Marduk standing over Kingu's body, the blood flowing, the severed vessels, the fashioning of a new kind of being from the substance of the old. The text does not say that Kingu's line ended. It says that it was transformed, that it became us. And if that is true, then somewhere in the deep genetic memory carried in our cells, there may still be traces of what Kingu was. Traces of the population that fought, that lost, that bled, and that became the raw material for what came after. We are not the first. We are the inheritors, and the blood of the defeated runs in our veins. The lizard people of Tel Al-Ubaid. In 1919, British archaeologist H.R. Hall began excavations at a low mound in southern Iraq, about 4 miles from the ancient city of Ur. The site was called Tel Al-Ubaid, and it would give its name to an entire prehistoric culture, the Ubaid period, spanning roughly 6500 to 3800 BC. Hall was searching for evidence of early Mesopotamian settlement, and he found it: pottery, tools, architectural foundations, graves. But he also found something else, something that did not fit comfortably into any existing interpretive framework. He found figurines, dozens of them, small clay sculptures ranging from 10 to 15 centimetres in height, depicting humanoid figures. But these were not ordinary human representations. The heads were elongated, almost conical, extending backward at an angle no human skull naturally takes. The eyes were rendered as deep, slanted slits, almond-shaped and oversized. The noses protruded forward in sharp, triangular forms, with prominent nostrils that gave them a distinctly reptilian appearance. The mouths were thin, horizontal incisions, almost lipless, and yet the bodies were unmistakably humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, hands with fingers, torsos that stood upright. Some of the figurines depicted women, identifiable by breasts and wide hips. One of the most striking examples showed a female figure holding an infant to her chest, the infant also possessing the same elongated head and reptilian features. Another figurine depicted a woman in the act of breastfeeding, the child at her breast rendered with the same non-human facial structure. These were not gods, they were not monsters, they were not abstract symbols. They appeared to be ordinary people engaged in ordinary domestic activities. The only problem was, they did not look human. Hall published his findings, and the figurines were catalogued and dispersed to various museums: the British Museum in London, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Scholars proposed interpretations. Perhaps they were depictions of deities. Perhaps they represented shamans wearing ritual masks. Perhaps they were symbolic representations of underworld beings, creatures associated with death or transformation. But none of these explanations fully accounted for the specificity of the features. If these were masks, why would every figurine, spanning multiple sites across several centuries, depict the same mask? If they were deities, why were they shown in mundane domestic postures rather than ceremonial or exalted ones? If they were symbolic, what exactly were they symbolizing? The most common scholarly interpretation today is that the figurines represent a stylistic convention, an artistic choice by the Ubaid culture to depict humans in an exaggerated, non-naturalistic form for ritual or religious purposes. The elongated heads, the argument goes, might reflect actual cranial deformation practices, where infant skulls were deliberately shaped through binding. The slit eyes and reptilian noses, in this view, are purely artistic exaggerations. But there are problems with this interpretation. First, cranial deformation, while practiced in various ancient cultures, produces a flattened or elongated skull shape, but it does not change the facial features. The eyes, nose and mouth remain human. The Ubaid figurines do not depict elongated human faces. They depict faces with fundamentally different structures, eyes positioned at angles, noses shaped like reptilian snouts, mouths reduced to slits. Second, the consistency is troubling. If this were an artistic convention, we would expect to see variation over time and across different sites. But the figurines are remarkably uniform. Whether found at Tel al-Ubaid, Eridu, or other Ubaid sites, the features remain the same. The elongated heads, the slit eyes, the reptilian noses. This suggests not stylistic variation, but representation of something real, or at least something the Ubaid people believed was real. Third, the figurines are not limited to ritual contexts. They have been found in domestic spaces, in graves, in workshops. They are not concentrated in temple precincts. They appear to have been everyday objects, perhaps household idols or representations of ancestors. If they depicted gods or supernatural beings, we would expect them to appear primarily in sacred contexts, but they do not. So what were the Ubaid people depicting? One possibility, rarely entertained in mainstream archaeology, is that the figurines are representational, that they depict beings the Ubaid people actually saw or remembered, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. This interpretation sounds fantastical, but consider the context. The Ubaid period spans more than 2,000 years, from approximately 6500 to 3800 BC. This is deep prehistory, a time when Homo sapiens had been present in the region for tens of thousands of years, but when the memory of earlier hominin populations might still have lingered. Neanderthals survived in the Levant and Anatolia until around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans were present in Asia. We do not know the full range of hominin diversity during this period. We do not know what isolated populations might have persisted in remote regions or coastal areas. What if the Ubaid figurines are depictions of an archaic hominin population, a population that coexisted with early Homo sapiens in the region, perhaps even interbreeding with them, before eventually disappearing? What if the elongated heads, the slit eyes, the reptilian features are not artistic conventions, but attempts to accurately render the appearance of these beings as they were remembered? This would explain the specificity. If the Ubaid people were trying to depict something real, they would aim for accuracy. The features would remain consistent because they were trying to capture the actual appearance of the beings they were representing. And if these beings engaged in ordinary domestic activities, nursing children, holding infants, that would explain why the figurines depict such scenes. The Ubaid people were not imagining gods or monsters, they were remembering a population that once lived alongside them. This interpretation aligns with the Sumerian texts that emerged 1,000 years after the Ubaid culture ended. The Sumerians, inheriting the region from the Ubaid people, wrote extensively about beings who came before, beings who were not entirely human, who possessed knowledge that had to be taught, who ruled before the flood. The Apkallu, with their fish-like features, the antediluvian kings, with their extraordinary lifespans, the Lulu Amelu, the mixed beings created from something that already walked the earth. The Ubaid figurines may be the visual record of the same tradition the Sumerians preserved in writing. The Ubaid people, lacking writing, expressed their memory in clay. The Sumerians, possessing writing, expressed it in cuneiform, but both were recording the same thing, the memory of a predecessor population, a population that was humanoid but not human, a population that lived, that interbred, that eventually vanished, but that left its mark on the cultures that came after. There is one more detail worth noting. The Ubaid figurines are not unique. Similar representations of reptilian-featured humanoids appear in other prehistoric contexts around the world. In the Jaemon culture of ancient Japan, there are clay figurines with exaggerated insect-like eyes and elongated heads. In the Vena culture of southeastern Europe, 5700–4500 BC, there are figurines with mask-like faces and bulging, oversized eyes. In the Valdivia culture of Ecuador, 3500–1800 BC, there are ceramic figures with elongated, non-human facial features. These could all be independent artistic traditions, each developing its own stylized way of depicting the human form. But they could also be independent records of encounters with the same phenomenon, archaic hominin populations lingering in isolated regions, remembered and depicted by the early farming cultures that eventually replaced them. The Ubaid figurines were not made recently. They were not made by people with any knowledge of modern paleoanthropology or evolutionary biology. They were made 7,000 years ago by a culture that did not write, that did not leave behind any explanation for what they were depicting. We can interpret them as ritual objects, as stylized art, as symbolic representations of the otherworldly, or we can take them at face value as portraits of beings with elongated heads, slit eyes, and reptilian features. Beings who, according to the Ubaid people's own creative output, engaged in ordinary human activities. Beings who held children, who nursed infants, who lived among the early inhabitants of Mesopotamia. Beings who, according to the Sumerian texts that followed, came before us, and who are no longer here. 18 temples, one foundation. The city of Eridu was not discovered by chance. The Sumerians themselves pointed the way. Every king list, every genealogy, every cosmological text traced kingship back to the same place. Eridu, the first city, the oldest of cities, the place where rulership descended from heaven. When archaeologists finally located the site, marked by a mound called Abu Sharain in southern Iraq, they expected to find an important settlement. What they did not expect was evidence that would rewrite the timeline of Mesopotamian civilization. Excavations at Eridu began in earnest in 1946, led by Iraqi archaeologist Fad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, working under the auspices of the Iraq Antiquities Department. They focused on the central mound, where ancient texts had indicated a great temple once stood, the Abzu, the house of the Abzu, sacred to the god Enki. What they uncovered was not one temple, but 18 successive temple structures, each built directly on top of the ruins of the previous one, each maintaining the exact same orientation, each positioned over the same sacred spot. This was not gradual urban sprawl, this was intentional continuity, a deliberate effort to preserve the sanctity of a specific location across millennia. The earliest temple, designated Temple Level 1, was small, a single room, approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, constructed of mud brick. In the centre of the room was a raised platform or altar, and in one corner a niche, likely for a cult statue or offering. The walls were plain, undecorated, but the construction technique was sophisticated, showing knowledge of architecture and planning. This was not a crude hut, it was a designed structure. The temple was dated through ceramic analysis and stratigraphy to approximately 5400 BC, nearly 3,000 years before the Sumerian civilization as we know it, and more than 7,000 years before the present day. It predates writing by more than 2,000 years. It predates the wheel. It predates monumental architecture elsewhere in the world. And it was built, according to its position, over a natural freshwater spring, as a temple to the Abzu, the subterranean realm of fresh water that the Sumerians believed was the source of all life and knowledge. The spring is still there. During the excavations, water seeped up through the ground beneath the temple foundations. For the people who built Temple Level 1, this was not symbolic. The Abzu was not a metaphor, it was physically present, bubbling up from beneath the earth, providing fresh water in an otherwise arid landscape. The temple was built directly over this source because, to its builders, this was where the divine and the earthly met. This was the opening to the realm below. The second temple, Temple Level 2, was built on the same spot sometime later. Archaeologists estimate around 5000 BC. It was slightly larger with more elaborate interior features, but it maintained the same orientation and the same focus on the water source. The third temple followed, then the fourth, fifth, sixth, all the way to the 18th and final temple, built during the early dynastic period, around 2500 BC, when Eridu was a fully developed Sumerian city. Each temple was larger and more elaborate than the last, reflecting increasing population, resources, and architectural ambition. But none of them strayed from the original foundation. None of them reoriented to face a different direction. None of them moved the sacred niche or the altar. For more than 3,000 years, the people who inhabited this site rebuilt the same temple in the same place over and over again. Why? The obvious answer is religious continuity. The site was sacred, so each generation honoured it by maintaining and rebuilding the temple. This is not unusual in the history of religion. Sacred sites persist. But what is unusual is that the earliest temple predates the Sumerian civilization by millennia. The people who built Temple Level 1 were not Sumerians. They were Ubaid people, the culture that preceded the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia. This raises a critical question. When the Sumerians arrived in the region around 4000 BC, did they invent the sacredness of Eridu, or did they inherit it? The evidence suggests the latter. The Sumerians did not found Eridu, they found it. It was already there, already ancient, already holy. The temple had been standing, in one form or another, for more than 1,000 years before the first cuneiform tablet was pressed. The Sumerians did not claim to have built the first temple. Their texts explicitly state that Eridu was the first city, that kingship descended there from heaven, that the god Enki established his dwelling in the Abzu beneath the city. They treated Eridu as a place of origin, not because they built it, but because they inherited it, and they maintained the temple tradition that predated them by more than a millennium. This suggests that the knowledge the Sumerians possessed, the architecture, the temple design, the orientation, the sacredness of the water source, was not invented by them, it was transmitted. From whom? The most straightforward answer is from the Ubaid people who preceded them. But the Ubaid people left no writing, no records of their theology or cosmology. So how did they know to build the temple there? How did they know to maintain it over so many generations? One possibility is that they too inherited the knowledge, that there was an even earlier population, one that identified the spring as sacred, that built the first structure, that established the tradition, a population whose memory the Ubaid preserved, and which the Sumerians in turn inherited. This would explain the Sumerian insistence that Eridu was not their invention. The texts do not say, "We built Eridu." They say, "Kingship descended to Eridu." They say, "In the beginning, Eridu was." They speak of it as something that existed before them, something they discovered, something they were entrusted to maintain. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian creation narratives, explicitly frames Eridu as the first of the 5 antediluvian cities. According to the text, after the gods created humanity and established the institution of kingship, they founded 5 cities before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each city had a god as its patron, and each city was ruled by kings whose reigns spanned thousands of years. Then came the flood, and the cities were destroyed. After the flood, kingship was re-established, but the new cities were different. The reigns were shorter, the rulers were more human. The text treats Eridu as the link between the pre-flood and post-flood worlds. It was the first city, and it survived, not in its physical form, but in its memory. The Sumerians rebuilt on the ruins, maintained the temple, preserved the traditions. They did not claim to be the originators, they claimed to be the inheritors. The archaeological record supports this. The stratigraphic layers at Eridu show no violent destruction between the Ubaid period and the Sumerian period. There is no evidence of conquest, of burning, of mass abandonment. Instead, there is continuity. The Ubaid culture gradually gave way to the Uruk culture, which in turn developed into the early dynastic Sumerian culture. The temple was maintained throughout. The sacredness of the site was never questioned. This suggests cultural transmission, not replacement. The Sumerians learned from the Ubaid. The Ubaid, in turn, may have learned from someone earlier. Knowledge was passed down, generation to generation, across thousands of years. And at the centre of that knowledge was the temple at Eridu, built over the opening to the Abzu. What was the Abzu? In Sumerian cosmology, it was the subterranean freshwater ocean, the source of rivers and springs, the realm of the god Enki. It was also the place where knowledge resided. Enki was not a god of war or kingship. He was the god of wisdom, of magic, of secret knowledge. He was the one who taught humanity the arts of civilization, and he dwelt in the Abzu beneath Eridu. If we take this literally, the Abzu is the aquifer beneath southern Mesopotamia, a vast underground reservoir of fresh water fed by rainfall and mountain runoff, accessible through springs and wells. In an arid landscape, such a water source would be invaluable, even miraculous. It would make sense to build a temple there, to honour it, to guard it. But the Sumerians did not simply honour the water. They claimed that knowledge came from the water. That wisdom emerged from the Abzu. That beings, the Apkallu, the 7 sages, rose from the depths to teach humanity. What if the Abzu represents not just a physical location, but a memory of a population that lived near the water? that understood hydrology and agriculture, that possessed knowledge the later inhabitants lacked. A population that taught the early settlers how to dig canals, how to irrigate fields, how to build structures that would last. A population that, in the collective memory of the Sumerians, was associated with the water because that is where they were encountered. Near the springs, near the marshes, near the coast. The 18 temples at Eridu are not just evidence of religious continuity, they are evidence of knowledge continuity. Someone 7,000 years ago identified that spring as sacred. Someone built a temple there. Someone taught their children to maintain it, to rebuild it, to honour it. And that teaching persisted unbroken for more than 3 millennia through cultural shifts, language changes, and the rise and fall of entire civilizations. The Sumerians inherited that knowledge, and they wrote it down. They told us where it came from, the Abzu. They told us who taught them, Enki, and the Apkallu, who served him. They told us when it began, before the flood. The temples are still there, one on top of another, descending into the earth like the layers of memory itself. The oldest temple, at the bottom, touches the water that was there before the temples, before the cities, before the Sumerians. The water that remembers. The flood as dividing line. In the British Museum, under catalogue number K3375, sits a clay tablet that caused a sensation when it was first translated in 1872. George Smith, a young assistant working through the thousands of tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, began reading what appeared to be an adventure story. A king named Gilgamesh, seeking immortality, travels to meet the only man who survived the Great Flood, a man named Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim tells him what happened. The gods decided to destroy humanity with a deluge, but the god E, in defiance of the decree, warned Utnapishtim through the wall of his reed house, tear down your house, build a boat. Abandon your possessions, save your life. Take aboard the seed of all living things. Utnapishtim obeyed. He built a massive vessel, sealed it with pitch, loaded his family, craftsmen, and animals. Then the storm came. For 6 days and 6 nights, the waters rose. Mountains were submerged. Humanity was turned to clay. When the rain stopped, the boat came to rest on Mount Nimush. Utnapishtim released a dove. It found no place to land and returned. He released a swallow. It too returned. Finally, he released a raven. The raven did not come back. The waters had receded. This was not the biblical flood. This was older by more than 1,000 years. The same story appears in the Atrahasis epic, in the Eridu Genesis preserved on tablet CBS 10673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and in fragmentary Sumerian texts from multiple sites. Each version varies in details, the name of the survivor changes, the duration of the flood shifts, the specific instructions differ, but the core narrative remains identical. There was a world before. That world was destroyed by water. A few survived. Civilization had to be rebuilt. And in every version, the flood is the dividing line. Before the flood, according to the Sumerian king list, 8 kings ruled for a combined 241,200 years. After the flood, kings ruled for centuries, then decades, then years indistinguishable from historical records. Before the flood, the Apkallu walked the earth, 7 sages who taught humanity the arts of civilization. After the flood, human scribes and priests took over, preserving what the Apkallu had taught. Before the flood, the texts describe a world of long-lived rulers, divine instruction, and cities built by beings who possessed knowledge humans had to be given. After the flood, humans built their own cities, wrote their own laws, and ruled themselves, but always with the memory that they were not the first. Why is the flood so consistent? Why does it appear in every major creation narrative from Mesopotamia And why does it always mark the boundary between two different kinds of existence? The standard scholarly answer is that catastrophic flooding was a regular occurrence in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded unpredictably, destroying settlements and forcing populations to migrate. Floods were traumatic, memorable, and thus entered the mythological record as divine punishment or cosmic reset. This explanation is reasonable. Archaeological evidence confirms that severe flooding occurred multiple times in the region's history. Excavations at Ur-Kish and Shuruppak have uncovered layers of water-deposited silt separating earlier and later occupation levels, but none of these floods were global. None of them match the scale described in the texts, and more importantly, none of them explain why the flood is consistently described as dividing two different kinds of world, not just two different dynasties or cities, but two different ages, with fundamentally different rules. There is another event, however, that does fit the description: the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, when melting glaciers caused global sea levels to rise by more than 120 meters. Coastal plains that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years were inundated. Entire landscapes vanished beneath the waves. If there were human populations living on those coastal plains, and archaeological surveys of the Persian Gulf floor suggest there were, they would have been forced to migrate inland as the waters rose. The Persian Gulf, in particular, offers a compelling possibility. During the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, the Gulf was almost entirely dry land. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers did not empty into the Gulf as they do now. They continued southeast across the exposed plains, eventually joining with the Karun River and flowing into the Gulf of Oman. This dry basin would have been habitable, with freshwater rivers, marshlands, and coastal access. It could have supported settlements, possibly even a thriving culture. Then the glaciers melted, sea levels rose, the basin flooded. The process was not instantaneous, it took place over millennia, but from the perspective of individual human lifespans, it would have been catastrophic. Each generation would have seen the waters encroaching further, swallowing villages, forcing migration. By around 8000 BC, the Gulf had reached roughly its present configuration. The coastal plains were gone. Whatever populations had lived there were displaced. Could this be the flood the Sumerians remembered? Could the antediluvian world, the world of long-lived rulers, of Apkallu sages, of cities built on knowledge humans had to be taught, have existed on those now submerged plains? Could the Sumerians, arriving in Mesopotamia thousands of years after the inundation, have inherited the memory of that lost world from the survivors who migrated inland? This would explain several puzzling features of the flood narratives. First, it would explain why the flood is described as total. To people living on the coastal plains, the rising waters would have seemed to cover the entire world. They had no knowledge of distant continents. Their world was the Gulf Basin, and their world was destroyed. Second, it would explain the emphasis on survival through boat building. If the inundation took place over centuries, populations would have had time to adapt, to build rafts and boats, to relocate to higher ground. The story of Utnapishtim or Utrahasis building a boat and loading it with animals is not necessarily a miraculous escape. It could be a memory of practical survival, of coastal populations using boats to evacuate as the waters rose, bringing with them their domesticated animals and seeds. Third, it would explain why the post-flood world is described as a world of rebuilding. If an advanced coastal culture was displaced by rising sea levels and forced to migrate to the less hospitable interior, to the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, they would have had to start over. The infrastructure, the irrigation systems, the settlements they had built on the coast were gone. They would have had to teach the next generation how to rebuild, how to adapt to a new environment. And fourth, it would explain why the pre-flood world is described as different. If the beings who lived on the now submerged coastal plains were biologically distinct, archaic hominins, late surviving Neanderthals or Denisovans, or even early Homo sapiens populations with different lifespans due to environmental or genetic factors, they would have been remembered as different. Not metaphorically, but literally. The flood did not just destroy cities, it marked the end of a population. There is indirect support for this interpretation in the genetic record. Studies of ancient dinar from the Near East show evidence of population turnover around 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, coinciding with the end of the Ice Age and the rise of agriculture. The genetic signature of earlier hunter-gatherer populations diminishes, replaced by a new profile associated with farming communities. This is usually explained as the demographic expansion of agricultural populations outcompeting hunter-gatherers, but it could also reflect the absorption or displacement of earlier populations who had lived on the now flooded coastal regions and who were replaced by migrants from the interior. The Mesopotamian texts do not describe the flood as a natural disaster. They describe it as intentional, decreed by the gods. Enlil, the chief god, is frustrated by the noise and proliferation of humanity and decides to wipe them out. Only Enki, the god of wisdom and the Abzu, defies the decree and warns the chosen survivor. This theological framing, gods making decisions, gods enacting punishment, is how pre-modern cultures explained large-scale catastrophes. But beneath the theology, the texts preserve practical details. The boat must be sealed with pitch. It must have specific dimensions. It must carry food, water and seeds. These are not mystical instructions. They are engineering specifications. The survivor, whether called Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, or Ziusudra, the Sumerian version of the name, is always described as exceedingly wise. He is not chosen because he is righteous, as in the biblical version, but because he is intelligent. He has the knowledge to understand the warning, to build the boat, to survive. And after the flood, he becomes the link between the old world and the new. He is granted immortality in the Gilgamesh version, not as a reward, but as a necessity. He must live long enough to transmit the knowledge, to teach the post-flood generations what was known before. This is the role of the survivor, not to repopulate the earth through biological reproduction alone, but to repopulate it with knowledge. The flood destroyed the physical infrastructure of the antediluvian world, but it did not destroy the information. That information survived in the memory of those who escaped, and they passed it down through oral tradition, through apprenticeship, through the careful teaching of each new generation, until it was finally written down in cuneiform more than 3,000 years after the waters rose. The Sumerians did not witness the flood, but they remembered it. They remembered it because they were the inheritors of those who survived, and they wrote the memory into clay so it would not be lost again. The flood is not a metaphor, it is a marker, a boundary in time. Before the flood, the world was one way. After the flood, it was another. And the difference was not theological. It was biological, geographical, and historical. The beings who ruled before the flood are gone. The lands they inhabited are submerged. But the knowledge they possessed was carried forward by the survivors. We are those survivors. And the flood is the reason we had to learn everything again. The biological plausibility. For most of human history, we believed we were alone, the only human species, the pinnacle of a long evolutionary chain, unique and unchallenged. That belief ended in 1856, when quarry workers in the Neander Valley of Germany uncovered a skeleton with a skull unlike any seen before. The brow ridge was pronounced. The skull was elongated and robust. The limbs were thick-boned. It was human, but not quite. This was the first Neanderthal fossil recognised by science, though it would take decades before the scientific community accepted that it represented a distinct species. In the intervening 170 years, the picture has become vastly more complex. We now know that Homo sapiens was not alone. We shared the planet with Neanderthals for tens of thousands of years. We shared it with Denisovans, a sister species to Neanderthals, known primarily from fragmentary remains and genetic traces. We shared it with Homo erectus, an earlier hominin that persisted in parts of Asia until at least 100,000 years ago, possibly later. We shared it with Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit species, which survived on the Indonesian island of Flores until approximately 50,000 years ago. We shared it with Homo naledi in southern Africa and with the enigmatic red deer cave people in China, whose remains date to as recently as 11,500 years ago. These were not distant relatives, they were contemporary populations, and we did not simply coexist at a distance. We encountered them, we interacted with them, and we interbred with them. This is no longer speculation, it is established genetic fact. In 2010, scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. By comparing it to modern human genomes, they discovered something extraordinary. Non-African humans carry approximately 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. This could only have occurred through interbreeding. Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, despite being distinct species, were interfertile. Their offspring were viable and reproduced. The same is true of Denisovans. Populations in Melanesia, Australia, and parts of Southeast Asia carry Denisovan DNA, up to 5% in some groups. There is even evidence of a third, as yet unidentified archaic hominin population contributing genetic material to modern humans in Africa. We are not a pure lineage, we are a composite species. Our genome is a mosaic of encounters, of minglings, of populations that met, interbred, and then, in most cases, vanished as distinct groups. The Neanderthals are gone, the Denisovans are gone, Homo floresiensis is gone, but their genetic material persists in us. We are their continuation. They did not disappear without a trace. They were absorbed. This is the biological context that makes the Mesopotamian texts suddenly more plausible. The idea that there were beings who came before, who were biologically distinct, who interbred with early humans and then vanished, this is not mythology. This is documented history. It happened. The only questions are, when did it stop happening, and what did those populations know? The conventional timeline places the last Neanderthal fossils at around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans seem to have disappeared around the same time. Homo floresiensis survived until 50,000 years ago. But these dates are based on the fossil record, which is notoriously incomplete. Soft tissue does not fossilize. Populations living in tropical or coastal environments, where preservation is poor, leave almost no trace. The absence of fossils is not proof of absence. There is evidence suggesting that some archaic hominin populations may have persisted longer than the fossil record indicates. The red deer cave people, discovered in southern China and dated to approximately 11,500 years ago, possessed a mix of archaic and modern features. They had robust skulls, prominent brow ridges, and unusual cranial proportions. Some researchers argue they represent a late surviving archaic population. Others suggest they are simply an isolated modern human group with unusual morphology. The debate continues. But here is what we know for certain. During the late Pleistocene, multiple hominin species coexisted. They occupied overlapping territories. They interbred. And then, relatively suddenly, only Homo sapiens remained. The other species disappeared, leaving behind only genetic traces and fragmentary fossils. What caused this disappearance? The standard explanations are competition, climate change, and demographic swamping. Homo sapiens, with our larger social groups, more sophisticated tools, and greater adaptability, outcompeted the other species. Climate fluctuations during the Ice Age reduced habitable zones, putting pressure on populations. And as Homo sapiens populations expanded, they assimilated smaller groups through interbreeding, diluting the genetic signature of archaic hominins until they ceased to exist as distinct populations. These explanations are plausible, but they leave room for an alternative reading of the Mesopotamian texts. What if the antediluvian rulers were remnants of these archaic populations? What if the Sumerians, arriving in Mesopotamia around 4000 BC, encountered not fossils but memories, oral traditions passed down from earlier inhabitants who had themselves encountered late surviving Neanderthals, Denisovans, or other archaic hominins? This is speculative, but it is not impossible. Consider the timeline. The last Neanderthals are dated to 40,000 years ago. The Sumerian civilization emerged around 3500 BC, roughly 5,500 years ago. That is a gap of more than 34,000 years, an enormous stretch of time, more than 6 times the entire span of recorded history. It seems implausible that oral tradition could preserve memory across such a gap. But memory is resilient. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions preserve stories of coastal flooding that occurred more than 7,000 years ago when rising sea levels inundated land now submerged beneath the ocean. These stories describe specific geographical features, islands, bays, land bridges that are confirmed by underwater archaeology. The memory lasted for 7,000 years without writing. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous traditions speak of volcanic eruptions and tsunamis that correlate with geological events to 2,000 years ago. In Iceland, the sagas record volcanic eruptions that occurred 1100 years ago. In India, the Mahabharata describes a great war with weapons that sound eerily like descriptions of nuclear explosions, a war that, if historical, occurred at least 3,000 years ago. Memory persists, not perfectly, not unchanged, but it persists, encoded in narrative, ritual and tradition. If a population of archaic hominins survived in isolated regions until, say, 15,000 or 10,000 years ago, well within the range of oral transmission, their existence could have been remembered. And if they possessed knowledge, tool-making, agriculture, navigation, astronomy, that early Homo sapiens populations lacked or learned from them, that knowledge would have been remembered too, attributed to the beings who taught it. The Mesopotamian texts describe the antediluvian rulers as long-lived. This too is biologically plausible. Longevity is influenced by developmental rate, metabolic efficiency, and environmental factors. Neanderthals are believed to have matured more slowly than Homo sapiens, reaching adulthood at a later age. If slower maturation correlated with longer lifespan, as it does in some species, Neanderthals could have lived significantly longer than modern humans. We have no way to test this directly. Aging leaves no trace in the fossil record. But the hypothesis is not absurd. And if the antediluvian rulers were members of a longer-lived species, their reign lengths, while exaggerated through millennia of oral transmission and numerological encoding, could reflect a biological reality. The texts describe these beings as possessing knowledge that humans lacked. Knowledge of writing, mathematics, agriculture, medicine, law. If an archaic hominin population developed these technologies first, perhaps in isolation, in a coastal environment with stable resources, and then transmitted them to Homo sapiens populations through contact and interbreeding, the memory of that transmission would be preserved. The humans who received the knowledge would remember that it came from outside, from beings who were different, from teachers who were not entirely like them. This is not to say that the Mesopotamian texts are literal history. They are not. They are shaped by theology, by numerology, by the narrative conventions of ancient Near Eastern literature. But they may preserve a core of historical memory, memory of a time when multiple hominin species coexisted, when knowledge was transmitted across species boundaries, and when the last of the archaic populations finally vanished, leaving only their genetic traces and the stories of those who remembered. We are not the first intelligent species on this planet. We are simply the only one left, and the memory of the others encoded in the oldest texts we possess, may be more accurate than we have been willing to admit. The pattern across cultures. The Mesopotamian flood narrative is not unique. It is part of a pattern that spans the globe, appearing in cultures that had no contact with one another, no shared textual tradition, no possibility of borrowing or influence, and yet the pattern is consistent. There was a world before. That world was destroyed by water. A few survived. And before the flood, that world was inhabited by beings who were different. Giants, gods, ancestors with extraordinary powers or lifespans. In the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 6 describes the Nephilim. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Then comes the flood in Genesis 7:8. After the flood, the Nephilim are gone. Only Noah's lineage remains, and the lifespans of his descendants decrease steadily until they reach normal human ranges. In Greek mythology, the world before the flood was inhabited by the Titans, giant primordial beings who ruled before the Olympian gods. The flood, sent by Zeus to destroy the corrupt Bronze Age of humanity, wipes out the world. Only Deucalion and Pyrrha survive, and they repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which become a new race of humans. In Hindu tradition, the Daityas and Danavas, races of giants and demon kings, inhabit the earth before the great deluge. The god Vishnu, in his Matsya avatar, warns Manu of the coming flood and instructs him to build a boat. After the flood, the old races are gone and a new age begins. In Mesoamerican tradition, the Quinametsin, giants who lived in the fourth sun, the age before the present, are destroyed when the world is flooded. Only a few humans survive by climbing mountains or building rafts. The new age, the fifth sun, is inhabited by ordinary humans. In Chinese mythology, the great flood during the reign of Emperor Yao covers the land. The hero Gun attempts to control the waters, but fails. His son, Yu the Great, succeeds and becomes the founder of the Seer dynasty, marking the transition from the mythological age to the historical period. In Norse mythology, the world is flooded by the blood of the giant Ymir when he is slain by Odin and his brothers. All the frost giants drown except one, Bergelmir, who escapes in a boat with his wife. From them the new race of giants descends, but they are diminished, less powerful than those who came before. In Native American traditions, particularly among the Pacific Northwest tribes, there are stories of a great flood that destroyed the world, preceded by a time when giant animals and powerful spirits walked the earth. After the flood, the world is remade, but the old beings are gone, transformed or diminished. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, the dream time, the age of creation, is populated by ancestral beings who shape the land, create life, and establish the laws. Then the waters rise, flooding the coasts and separating the land. The ancestral beings retreat into the earth, the sky, or the sea, and the age of ordinary humans begins. These are not variations on a single story. They emerge from different continents, different languages, different cultural contexts. They could not have influenced one another, and yet the structure is the same: a pre-flood world inhabited by powerful or long-lived beings, a catastrophic deluge, the survival of a remnant, and the beginning of a new age populated by ordinary humans. Mainstream scholarship explains this through the theory of universal human experience. Floods are common. They are traumatic. They destroy settlements and displace populations. Every culture experiences floods, and every culture therefore develops flood myths. The presence of powerful pre-flood beings is explained as a narrative device, a way of marking the mythological past as different from the historical present. Giants and gods represent the distant past, while ordinary humans represent the knowable present. This explanation is reasonable, but it does not account for the specificity. Why do so many cultures describe the pre-flood beings as biologically distinct? Why are they consistently larger, longer lived, or possessing of knowledge that humans lack? Why is the flood always the dividing line? An alternative explanation is that these traditions preserve a collective memory of the end of the Ice Age, a period of rapid climate change, rising sea levels, a massive ecological disruption that occurred roughly 12,000 to 8,000 years ago. Human populations worldwide would have experienced the flooding of coastal regions, the loss of habitable land, and the displacement of entire communities. This trauma would have been remembered, passed down through oral tradition, and eventually encoded in myth. But there is another layer. What if these traditions also preserve the memory of encountering archaic hominin populations? Populations that were in fact different, taller, more robust, longer lived, or possessing knowledge that Homo sapiens populations lacked. Neanderthals were physically stronger and had larger brains than Homo sapiens. Denisovans adapted to high-altitude environments through unique genetic mutations. Homo floresiensis, while small, survived for tens of thousands of years in isolation, suggesting remarkable adaptability. These were not primitive brutes. They were intelligent, capable populations with their own technologies and cultures. If late surviving populations of these species were encountered by early Homo sapiens, they would have been remembered. And they would have been remembered as different. Not metaphorically, but literally. The stories of giants, of long-lived ancestors, of beings who taught humanity the arts of civilization, these could be distorted, exaggerated, theologically reframed memories of actual encounters. The flood in this reading is not just a memory of rising sea levels, it is a memory of the extinction event. The end of the Ice Age was catastrophic for many species. Megafauna went extinct. Ecosystems collapsed. Human populations were forced to adapt rapidly or die. If archaic hominin populations were already small, already isolated, the combination of climate change, flooding, and competition with expanding Homo sapiens populations could have driven them to extinction. The survivors, Homo sapiens populations, who had interbred with, learned from, and outlasted the archaic hominins, would have carried forward the memory. And that memory, passed down through countless generations, would eventually be written into the oldest texts we possess: the Sumerian king list, the Eridu Genesis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Genesis, the Mahabharata, the Popol Vuh, the Norse Eddas, the Aboriginal Dreamtime stories, all of them telling the same story. There was a world before, inhabited by beings who were different, and that world ended in water. We are the survivors. And the memory of those who came before is still here, encoded in myth, preserved in text, waiting for us to recognize it for what it is. Not invention, not metaphor, but memory, what the clay remembers. In the museum vault, the Ubaid figurine sits in its climate-controlled case, unchanged for 7,000 years. The elongated head, the slit eyes, the reptilian nose, the infant at the breast, equally strange, equally humanoid, equally other. Visitors pass by, read the placard, move on. Ritual object, Ubaid period, 5000 BC. Purpose unknown, purpose unknown. But perhaps the purpose was simply this: to remember, to preserve in clay what could not be preserved in flesh, to leave behind a record, however crude, however misunderstood by future generations, that something else once walked here, something that looked almost human, but not quite, something that held children, that built temples, that knew where the water came from and how to honour it, something that taught and then was gone. The Sumerian texts tell us the same thing, in words pressed into tablets with the same kind of care. They tell us that kingship descended from heaven, that the first cities were not built by the Sumerians, but inherited, that beings with extraordinary lifespans ruled before the flood, that sages emerged from the waters to teach humanity writing, mathematics, law, agriculture. That the world before was different from the world after. That knowledge was transmitted, not invented. They tell us this not in vague poetic language, but in lists, in genealogies, in chronologies, in the same documentary style used to record the grain rations distributed to workers, the taxes collected from cities, the treaties signed between kings. They treated their past with the same seriousness they treated their present. And we have dismissed it as myth. Perhaps we are wrong to do so. Perhaps the Sumerians were not inventing stories to explain their origins. Perhaps they were doing what any culture does when confronted with ruins, with artifacts, with traditions they did not create. They recorded what they found. They preserved what they were taught. They wrote down the memory so it would not be lost. Modern science has confirmed that the premise of their texts is not impossible. Multiple hominin species did coexist. They did interbreed. They did possess knowledge, culture, technology. They did vanish, leaving only genetic traces and fragmentary fossils. The Mesopotamian texts may be the fullest written record we have of what happened when those species met, what was exchanged, and what was remembered. This does not mean the texts are literal history. Numbers were exaggerated, events were compressed. Theological interpretations were layered over factual memory. The gods of the texts, Enki, Enlil, Ninmah, Marduk, are not historical figures. They are personifications, symbols, narrative devices. But beneath the theology, beneath the numerology, beneath the literary conventions, there may be a core of truth. There were beings before us. They taught us. They disappeared. We remain. And if that is true, then every tablet, every king list, every flood narrative, every creation myth is not a fantasy. It is a memorial, a monument in language to those who came first, those who built the first temple at Eridu over the spring that opened to the Abzu, those who emerged from the coastal waters, dressed in the skins of fish, to teach the survivors how to write, how to measure, how to plant, those who ruled for thousands of years and then were swept away when the sea levels rose and the old world drowned. The clay remembers. It has no choice. It is inert, unchanging, patient. It waits in museums, in archives, in the hands of scholars who translate and interpret and debate. It waits for us to stop reading it as mythology and start reading it as testimony from a people who knew they were not the first, who honoured those who came before, who built their temples on the foundations laid by others, who wrote down what they were taught, and who taught their children to preserve it generation after generation, so that when people like us, thousands of years in the future, finally learn to read the script, we would know. We are not alone in time. We are part of a continuity, a chain of knowledge, of transmission, of inheritance that reaches back beyond the first cities, beyond the first writing, beyond the flood, into a world we can barely imagine. A world where beings with elongated heads and reptilian features held their children and taught them how to survive. A world where sages emerged from the waters and showed humanity how to build. A world where kings ruled for millennia because they were not like us. That world is gone, but it is not forgotten. The Sumerians remembered, and they wrote it down, and the clay holds it still. All we have to do is listen, not with the assumptions of modern skepticism, but with the openness of an investigator, following the evidence wherever it leads. The evidence in the tablets, the evidence in the figurines, the evidence in the temples built one on top of another for 3,000 years, the evidence in our own dinar carrying traces of species that no longer exist. The Sumerians were not primitive, they were not superstitious, they were not making things up to explain what they did not understand. They understood perfectly well. They knew they were inheritors. They knew their civilization was built on something older, and they honoured it by recording it, by preserving it, by passing it down. This is not the end of the investigation. It is the beginning. The question is not whether the Sumerians described something real. The question is, what exactly did they describe? What did those beings look like? How did they live? What happened to them? And how much of what we call human civilization is actually theirs, transmitted to us across the boundary of the flood by the few who survived to teach the next generation? The answers are not in a single tablet. They are in the pattern that emerges when we compare the texts, when we examine the archaeology, when we study the genetics, when we take the Sumerians seriously as documentarians of their own past. They told us there were beings before us, beings who ruled for impossible lengths of time, beings who taught humanity the foundations of civilization, beings who vanished when the world was flooded, beings who were different biologically, morphologically, culturally, but who left their knowledge behind. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were right. The clay waits, the tablets wait, the memory waits, and the question remains, quiet and patient, pressed into cuneiform 7,000 years ago. What if they were not inventing? What if they were remembering? Rest now, let the question settle, let the evidence sift through your thoughts as you drift towards sleep. The mystery does not demand an answer tonight. It has waited this long, it can wait longer, but it will not go away. Because the evidence does not go away. The tablets are still there, the figurines are still there, the temples are still there, one on top of another, descending into the earth, touching the water that was there before the Sumerians, before the Ubaid, before the cities, before us. The water remembers, the clay remembers, and somewhere in the deep stratigraphy of human memory, we remember too. We just forgot that we remembered. Until now.